Okay, everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about China. Before we looked at Europe during the time period we call the Middle Ages. And while we can debate over, the quality of life in Europe at that time, it wasn't, necessarily a time of expansion, more a time of sort of small villages and stuff like that. But if we treat that like it was the quote dark ages, then one of the things we're missing out on is that a lot of the world was pretty different during that time period. For one thing, when we looked at the Islamic caliphates, we saw that the Islamic world was doing really well. Like places like Baghdad and Cordoba were doing really well. Things were expanding and thriving, and there was a lot of science and knowledge. And we'll find that the same thing is done in China. So just like Islam had a golden age, the Islamic civilizations had a golden age during that time period. China also had a golden age during that time period, maybe a couple of golden ages. Let's think about the different dynasties of China we've looked at. We looked at the Shang and the Zhou at the very beginning. We looked at the brief Qin dynasty that gave China its name and its first emperor, but that only lasted his lifetime. And then we had the Han dynasty, which was a time of Confucianism being really successful and a lot of different things prospering in various ways. So that was a good time for China. And when we look at the dynasties that we're going to look at today, we'll find something very similar going on. And these are the Tang and the Song Chinese dynasties. And the Tang and Song are times of economic success, intellectual growth. For one thing, Buddhism is coming into China, so that's going to change the culture of China in some big ways. Um, and yeah, and also science and knowledge and stuff like that. So let's take a look. All right, let's get into the slideshow here. Okay, so some people will call Tang China the Chinese Golden Age. So Tang China is around from the 600s to the 900s. So compare that to around the time of the first caliphates, kind of well after the fall of Rome, during the middle of the Middle Ages in Europe. Yeah, and China is thriving. China is doing great. The Tang time is a time of economic success. And yeah, and people are doing pretty well. It seems like the emperor of China is living up to Confucian values, and this is a big time for Confucianism, of helping the common people grow and thrive, making sure there's enough food to eat, stuff like that, and also people are buying and selling like crazy. It's great. So let's take a closer look at that, and then we can also take a closer look at the other dynasty of China. And yeah, and I should note that China just sort of regularly falls apart. Between the different dynasties that we've looked at, we haven't gone into this super much, but things go out of control, and you get different groups struggling for power, kind of like it was all the way back in the Warring States period. Between the Zhou Emperor and not Zhou Emperor, the Zhou King and the first Qin Emperor. There were all these different states, cities, and whatnot competing for power. But the thing about China is it usually reunifies, maybe in part because that sort of bowl of the valleys and the rivers is a very sort of convenient place to go. So pretty frequently it all consolidates under one ruler again. And that's what we see between the Tang and the Song. We have the Tang dynasty, and then we have a period of 10 kingdoms, and then it all comes back together in the Song dynasty. So the Song dynasty is a little bit smaller, but it's still an age of prosperity, and it lasts for a good 300 years, lasts until the 1200s. And even better, it's also a time of inventions and exploration. So China is beginning to send ships out to explore the world during the Song dynasty. So that's pretty darn cool. Okay, so if you think about these times of prosperity, this would be a good time to promote Confucian ideas. And we'll get a little bit more into Buddhist ideas and how they come in. But in a time of prosperity, think about it. What would you do if you were emperor? How would you try and spread Confucius's ideas? Would you try and live up to his example? Would you try and spread the knowledge around? Get people really invested? Um, one thing you might want to do is offer some kind of rewards for people being really familiar with Confucius's ideas. Say that these are the people who are going to succeed in society the most. That could be a way to do it if you think those ideas are really valuable, and make sure that all your governors and all your lieutenants and whatnot really know those ideas very well. And that's what we see the Tang Dynasty doing. Um, and the Tong came up with a pretty brilliant way to get everybody on board for this. And here's what they did: they had tests, they had standardized exams, basically, for the government. Now, these were, yeah, you might compare them to our standardized exams, but in fact, they were even more terrifying because the stakes were so high. Basically, if you did well on these tests, you would get a place, you would get a higher rank in the government. So there would be, tiers of what kind of jobs you could get based on how well you did on this one exam that you took at one point in your life, and then ever after, your life was based around how well you did on that one exam. It's pretty intense. And what do you have to study for this exam? You have to learn all the Confucian classics. So these are the sort of stuff from the Zhou period that it was said that Confucius was interested in, that maybe he had edited or collect them. So there's a lot of poetry and songs in there too, in addition to the more practical stuff. But also you've got to learn all the sort of practical ideas of Confucianism, the sort of standard ideas of how to take care of people, how to make the rice fields grow effectively. And you even have to be good at poetry. You have to be able to compose your own poems in the classic Confucian style. So this is all coming out of what we call the Neo-Confucian movement. So this was sort of people revisiting Confucianism during the Tang Dynasty. Neo means new. And they weren't content just to, throw people at the Confucian books and say, okay, get practicing. They also wanted to make sure people had, quote, the correct interpretations, that they did things the way that their sort of group of thought wanted people to do them. And it tended to be less mystical and more pragmatic. So less, people weren't going to treat Confucius as a god. They were going to teach him as a guy, treat him as a guy with good advice. That was sort of the standard Neo-Confucian idea. Okay, so to take these tests, you have to basically stay in the same cubicle for 3 days straight. So you write essays for 3 days straight on all these Confucian things, and you write some poetry to show off your poetry skills. And yeah, and you don't get to leave your cubicle for 3 days. And this is the only way to get the really good government jobs, which are called civil service jobs. Working for the government is civil service. And yeah, and then people would find out how they did. They would look up on the wall and see what rank they got, and they would just have to go there and find out. That must have been the most terrifying experience in your life. And in theory, right, this should theoretically make the government jobs a meritocracy, like people who are good at Confucianism, which has some relation to being good at government, because it has lots of good advice and whatnot. People who are good at Confucianism should theoretically be the ones who are getting the higher position in society, and theoretically you can start off. It doesn't matter who you are; you can be a poor person and learn all about Confucianism, and then have a really competitive job in the government. And yeah, and people would say that during the time and pat themselves on the back. Anyone can be a good leader. Um, but let's think about the logistics of this a little bit. First off, to know about Confucianism, you have to be able to read and write. And then on top of that, you have to be really able to study because you need to have so much knowledge. So you need to be a person who has enough free time to really study, that you're not going to have to like farm constantly to pay the bills. You're going to have, and to put food on your table. You're going to have to like really have some time to spend on this, and maybe some money to spend on the books and whatnot. You have to bring your own ink pens and whatnot to do these government exams. So in practice, there tend to be what was called a scholar class. a group of people kind of middle class on up who were doing well, who were maybe successful merchant families or had already had family members in government. They tended to be the ones who did the best on the exams. So there was definitely a class distinction thing here. That said, it's not that someone couldn't work their way up in the ranks. It was just that it was going to be really hard to do so. And you didn't see that as often as maybe they wanted to say that you saw that. Okay, but yeah, let's look a little bit more at these exams. So because they were so competitive, there was of course a lot of cheating. And if you got cheating, you were severely, severely punished because that was bad. But I think you got like huge fines put on you, maybe even like imprisonment and stuff like that. But and obviously you weren't going to get the jobs. But people did cheat. We have some great examples of like this guy had a cheating undershirt. So if he was, trying to remember the answers on the exam, he could just pull out his shirt and, look down the shirt, and then he could theoretically do well on the exam. So yeah, the stakes were high, as they are whenever anyone has a competitive tests. That's why people worry so much about cheating. Yeah, so you had these very basic cells where people just stay for a while. Okay, so they do come. Sorry, I misspoke. They do come with writing brushes and ink, but you do have to bring your own food. So pack 3 lunches and dinners for this experience. And you do get a bedroll, so you have to sleep in your cell. Also, you have to like use a bucket because you're not supposed to leave the cell. So I can't imagine like trying to write essays while you've got the smell of that. But apparently people did it. It's pretty wild though. But yeah, they had these big suites of cubicles where people would sleep. I think they were a bit bigger than this. This is more of a modern thing where you don't have to stay the whole time. But like these kind of rooms right here where you sleep and you eat and you write essays for 3 days straight. But yeah, so that's a kind of a big sign of what the times were like. They were really trying to find, quote, the best of the best, or what they thought was the best of the best. And it does seem to have helped them in their government. It seems to have been a time where things were growing and thriving. One of the things that we see is some of the palaces that were built at this point, like the Tang Dynasty capital, they're using a grid plan. So they're really trying to analyze what makes the best city. And when you see grid plans in history, that means things are pretty organized. So they had this square palace and this almost, or rectangular palace and this almost square city where everything was just very perfectly laid out. You have a market on this side, a marketplace on that side. It's all very, very carefully designed. So that's the kind of thought process they want people to be putting into their leadership. Okay. And we can talk about Buddhism as well. We'll probably have more time for that in the next video, but let's just think about how Buddhism traveled to China. We said it was happening from like the 100 to 900. That's the time period of the Tang and Song dynasties, or at least the start of the Song dynasty. And so Buddhism traveled up from the Buddhist place of origin and traveled out through India, but didn't really last in India as much. And went into China, places like China, Mongolia, Tibet, and really stuck around there way more than it did in India, with the exception of northeastern India where it started. But you can see that that's a pretty good location to be to spread to places like Tibet and China and Mongolia. Also to Japan, Korea. So these are the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads basically all the trade routes that kind of go along this pathway here. They lead into China and over to places like Persia and Rome. So Rome was trading with China. That's something we didn't get into super much, but Rome was trading with China, and then after Rome fell, there were still empires trading with China, and the Byzantines were trading with China. Although less than they used to be, because the Byzantines had stolen the Chinese silkworms, so they figured out how to make their own silk. But they still did a lot of trade. Okay, so that's all that we have time for in this video. Next time we'll talk more about Buddhism.